In a quiet suburb, seemingly innocent relationships led to chaos and murder. It all started with a forbidden affair, but the consequences turned out to be far more serious than anyone could have expected. This is the story of Laura, a devoted Christian wife, and her Muslim neighbor Sam. Their romance, shrouded in secrecy, would lead to a crime that shook the entire community. The events took place in 2009, and at first glance, Laura's life seemed to be everything a Christian wife could dream of, living in a modest but well-kept home in a peaceful neighborhood of Atlanta, Georgia. She was married to Michael, a respected man in their church community for his devoted faith. Michael was 38 years old, a pillar of the church, often leading prayers and participating in every Sunday service. He was a disciplined, punctual man with a quiet authority. However, their marriage was always one-sided. To the outside world, Laura and Michael appeared to be the perfect Christian couple, but inside the home, Laura felt a constant emptiness. Laura was 35 years old and a homemaker, taking care of their two children, Susan and Dan, who were 12 and 8 years old. She actively participated in church affairs, Sunday school, charity events, and women's meetings, but none of this filled the inner void. Michael, although a good provider, had become emotionally distant over the years. They rarely spent time together outside of church events. Laura yearned for warmth, attachment, and someone who could see her true self beyond the roles of wife and mother. In the silence of her own home, Laura felt invisible. She often sat by the window, watching the world around her, reflecting on whether life would always seem like a series of routine duties, devoid of genuine connection. The love that she once thought would grow over time had stagnated, and Michael seemed more interested in his faith and the image their family projected than in her needs or feelings. It was during these moments of reflection that she first noticed Sam. He moved into the neighboring house in the spring of 2009 with his wife Alicia and their newborn son. Sam was 32 years old, quiet and polite, always friendly waving when they met. He was a civil engineer, working a lot but always finding time for his family. His wife Alicia stayed at home with the baby and rarely went out, as she suffered from postpartum depression. The interaction between Sam and Laura began innocently. They discussed neighborhood issues or the children's affairs. Laura noticed Sam's gentle nature, which starkly contrasted with the coldness and indifference she often felt from Michael. Over time, the two families began to socialize more, attending barbecues and other neighborhood events. Sam always showed kindness and respect, and soon Laura began to feel emotions towards him that she did not expect. Laura never thought about cheating on her husband, but she could not ignore her growing feelings. She tried to suppress them, reminding herself of her marital vows and the faith she was supposed to uphold. However, every time she spoke with Sam, an irresistible connection arose. He too seemed to be going through difficulties in his marriage. Alicia's depression had created a distance between them, leaving Sam lonely and emotionally drained. In many ways, he experienced the same isolation that Laura felt in her own home. By mid-2010, their meetings became more frequent. Laura began to find opportunities to accidentally bump into Sam, whether it was during morning chores or when picking up the mail. Their conversations became deeper. They discussed their lives, their problems, and the loneliness they both felt. Sam admired Laura's intelligence and strength in managing the household, and Laura admired Sam's calmness and attentiveness. He listened to her in a way that Michael never did. Late at night, Laura often thought about these conversations, feeling both guilt and excitement. She knew that what she felt was wrong, but the feeling of being seen and understood was something she hadn't experienced in years. It was like a light in the darkness of her monotonous life. Sam also felt confused. He grew up in a conservative Muslim family where marriage was considered sacred and adultery strictly forbidden. But his connection with Laura seemed to be something more than just attraction, as if they understood each other's pain. He often thought about her at work, wondering how she was coping with the coldness in her marriage. He justified his feelings by telling himself that he was providing Laura with the emotional support she needed, but deep down he knew he had crossed a dangerous line. By mid-2010, their relationship had reached a new level. What began as emotional support had turned into something physical. One evening, Sam invited Laura over under the pretext that he needed to borrow something for the garden. Alicia had gone to her family, and Laura's children were already asleep. They sat together in Sam's living room, with tension hanging in the air. Neither of them had planned what happened next, but at that moment, they could no longer resist their mutual attraction. This moment changed everything. From that evening on, they began to meet in secret whenever they could. Their romance was kept hidden from their spouses and neighbors. Laura would sneak into Sam's house when Alicia was absent, and they would spend hours together. Guilt weighed heavily on both of them, but the forbidden nature of their relationship only intensified their passion. Laura, being a devoted Christian, prayed for forgiveness every night, but the next day she would find herself in Sam's arms again. She understood that she was breaking all her principles, but she could not stop. She was drawn to this forbidden pleasure. Sam, on the other hand, began to justify his actions by convincing himself that his marriage to Alicia was already on the brink of destruction and that he was giving Laura what she desperately needed: love and attachment. However, the affair began to have a negative impact on Sam. He became more distant at home, avoiding conversations with Alicia, who began to suspect that something was wrong. The calm and collected Sam began to crack under the weight of the secret that was becoming too heavy for him. By the end of 2010, both Laura and Sam realized they were heading towards a catastrophe. They had crossed a line that they could not return from. They were entangled in a web of deceit and passion, and they knew that if their spouses ever found out, the consequences would be devastating. But despite this, they could not stop. Laura, torn between guilt and desire for Sam, led a double life. During the day, she pretended to be the perfect wife and mother, and at night, she indulged in the forbidden romance. Sam was also consumed by his feelings for Laura, unable to break free from her influence. Their romance had become an addiction that they both knew would eventually lead to their downfall. By the end of 2011, the weight of the affair began to press heavily on both Laura's and Sam's lives. What had once seemed like a salvation had become an unbearable burden, and it was becoming increasingly difficult for both of them to maintain the appearance of a normal life. Laura, who had once been an attentive and active homemaker, began to neglect her duties. The dinners she used to prepare with care now seemed like a heavy burden, and the time spent with her children became less frequent. Her smiles, once warm and genuine, now looked strained, as if she were hiding something dark. Michael, always a strict and disciplined man, could not help but notice these changes. At first, he thought Laura was just tired or overburdened with church duties, but over time, he could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. He began to pay more attention to her actions, noticing how she started coming home later than usual, citing church meetings or errands. Sometimes she avoided his gaze or gave vague explanations when he asked about her day. As a man of deep faith, Michael believed he could handle any marital problems through prayers and seeking advice from the church. Meanwhile, the situation in Sam's house was becoming equally tense. Alicia had always been sensitive to her husband's moods, and in the last few months, his behavior had become increasingly strange. He was distracted, often leaving the house at unusual hours, citing work or errands. Alicia, still suffering from postpartum depression, felt more alone than ever. She tried to talk to Sam about their marriage, but he either brushed off her concerns or blamed her, accusing her of not being a good enough wife or mother. Arguments became more frequent, and the peace that once reigned in their home began to crumble. By early 2012, the tension from the secret relationship had become unbearable for both Laura and Sam. Guilt gnawed at Laura from within, especially on Sundays when she sat in church, listening to sermons about fidelity, sin, and judgment. Her Christian upbringing led her to live in constant fear of eternal damnation. Every time she looked at her children, she thought about the lies she was feeding them. And every time she looked at Michael, she feared that he would see her true nature hidden behind smiles and routine. Sam also felt the pressure. His faith had always been an important part of his life, and although he was not as open about his religious beliefs as Laura, the teachings of Islam weighed heavily on his conscience. Adultery was not just a sin. It was a betrayal of everything he believed was right. Nevertheless, Every time he thought about ending their affair, the thought of Laura disappearing from his life was too painful. In February 2012, everything reached a critical point. Alicia, tired of Sam's evasive behavior, directly demanded an explanation. She noticed that he had become distant and emotionally detached, and his lies were beginning to unravel. Sam denied everything, blaming work and the stress caused by the birth of their child, but Alicia was not satisfied with his explanations. The tension in their marriage reached its peak. At the same time, Michael's suspicions about Laura were growing stronger. He began to closely monitor her actions, noticing how she often seemed distracted even in simple conversations. Laura was so consumed by her feelings for Sam that she could no longer maintain the facade that allowed her to lead a double life. Her anxiety increased, but every time she thought about breaking off the relationship with Sam, she returned to him, unable to let go of the connection they shared. The romance reached its climax. On the night of March 3, 2012, a severe storm swept through Atlanta, accompanied by torrential rains and strong winds. However, the weather was nothing compared to the storm that erupted in Laura's home. Michael had gone on a church retreat for the weekend, giving Laura the perfect opportunity to meet with Sam. She carefully planned the evening, making sure the children were with her mother and that no one in the neighborhood would suspect anything. But fate decided otherwise. Michael, for reasons unknown to Laura, returned from the retreat early. Perhaps his suspicions had become too strong, or something bothered him during the trip. In any case, he entered the house without warning and saw a scene he could never have imagined. His wife in the arms of another man. What followed was absolute chaos. The anger that gripped Michael was instant and furious. Without thinking, he lunged at Sam, grabbing the nearest object, a kitchen knife that lay on the table. The fight was fierce, filled with anger, betrayal, and despair. Laura, frozen in shock, could only watch as the men grappled with each other. In the heat of the struggle, Sam managed to wrest the knife from Michael's hands, but the momentum caused the knife to plunge twice into Michael's chest. Laura, shocked and driven mad by what she had seen, could not move. The reality of what had happened gradually began to penetrate her consciousness, filling her mind with feelings of guilt, fear, and despair. Sam, who still stood nearby, breathing heavily, seemed unable to believe what had happened. He looked at Laura, then at Michael's body, trying to comprehend how their romantic connection had led to such a catastrophe. It became clear to him that they had reached a point of no return. In a panic, Sam left the house, disappearing into the night, leaving Laura in her shattered world. In the morning, neighbors noticed that something was wrong in Laura's house. An anonymous tip led to the arrival of the authorities. When officers entered the house, they were met with a horrifying scene. Laura was found in a state of shock, unable to explain what had happened. Her mind seemingly shut down, trapped in her own memories. Investigators quickly began to unravel the situation. Inconsistencies in her accounts, evidence at the scene, and statements from neighbors pointed to complex relationships between all the participants in this tragic triangle. The police began searching for Sam, who had disappeared immediately after the tragedy, understanding that his secret was now exposed. Interrogations continued, and Laura, despite desperate attempts to protect Sam, could not hide the truth for long. The evidence spoke for itself. Their romance was the central cause of the tragedy. Secret meetings, lies, and forbidden desires intertwined in a web of deceit that soon began to unravel before the eyes of the public. Sam was found several days later, hiding in a motel. When he was arrested, he tried to explain his actions as self-defense, claiming that he was simply defending himself from Michael's rage. However, the evidence and witness statements painted a different picture. A man whose emotions and fears had taken over, leading to an irreparable tragedy. The trial attracted the attention of the entire community and became a topic of endless discussion. Laura, once the quiet and devoted wife, now appeared before the public in a new light. Her image as the ideal Christian woman collapsed with the revelation of the details of her affair with Sam. In the courtroom, there was no room for illusions. Every gesture, every glance under the scrutiny of the jury and journalists. Laura sat, pale and trembling, her world falling apart. Sam, who had once seemed like a calm and collected person, looked devastated. His once confident demeanor had disappeared, leaving only a shadow of the man who had once lived next door to Laura. The prosecution built a case against him, portraying him as a man who had allowed his emotions to take control. They presented a detailed description of that fateful evening, emphasizing the intensity of the passions that ultimately led to the tragedy. The trial was long and difficult. Prosecutors and defense attorneys meticulously examined every aspect of their lives, every step that led to the fatal confrontation. Witnesses gave testimony, describing the strange changes in Laura's and Sam's behavior over the past few months. Neighbors spoke of mysterious visits, of glances and whispers that had once seemed insignificant. Laura, realizing that her lies could no longer protect her, gave a confessional statement. She told of how her feelings for Sam had grown into a romance that she had long hidden from her husband and surroundings. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she described how she had lost control of the situation, sinking deeper into lies and betrayal. However, Sam's defense was built on a different premise. He claimed it was self-defense. Lawyers insisted that Michael, returning home that evening, had attacked Sam, and that Sam had no choice but to defend himself. Prosecutors, on the other hand, pointed out that Sam could have prevented this tragedy if not for his unconsidered decisions and hidden motives. By the time the jury retired to deliver the verdict, the entire community of Atlanta was watching the process with bated breath. It was hard for them to believe that behind the facade of a respectable life, such deep secrets could be hidden. Laura and Sam's romance, which began as emotional support, had turned into a destructive force that took Michael's life and shattered several families. When the verdict was announced, it brought relief to some and disappointment to others. Sam was sentenced to 25 years in prison for involuntary manslaughter. Laura, receiving a lighter sentence for her cooperation with the authorities, was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Her remorse was evident, but the consequences of her actions had forever changed her life and the lives of her children. The community, once tightly knit, was shaken by this scandal. The local church, where Michael was a respected member, lost the trust of many parishioners who could no longer ignore the dark secrets hidden behind closed doors. Sarah and Dan, Laura and Michael's children, were left orphans. They were sent to relatives, where they tried to rebuild their lives after the devastating loss.